Hello and welcome to our ZRS podcast. This month we are talking to and about BESS, so battery energy storage systems. We're talking about the rate of adoption and how this changes the risk landscape and what it means for our commonly known risks like fire, but as well as new ones due to the rate of this adoption. I'm Himat Sohal. I'm a specialist risk engineer focusing on sustainable energy working for ZRS, and I'm alongside
Sean Grundy, actually power systems risk engineer for ZRS also. Him and I are leading our understanding of how the risk profile is changing as technology comes into the energy transition space. So thank you, Himmat. Great introduction. What's interesting with the landscape of risk now with the BESS systems is changing from typically a safety risk, the fire risk, which we've all been focused on over the last few years. And now what we see is the consideration and the integration of things like cyber, climate change. When we look at mergers and acquisitions in the marketplace now, we see the BESS assets being bought and sold different times through the life cycle. There are risks associated with those kind of positions in life cycle, but also the activities of that. And so what we are really talking about today is how they come together to form a different kind of risk landscape that we all must be considering.
Yeah. So we're talking about these risks individually, or we're talking more about how they interact with each other and the whole risk landscape as a whole in terms of the interconnectivity of this piece.
Yeah, interestingly, right. The paper that ZRS have produced does both, right? But the premise here is that actually the landscape is wider than the safety risk that we have all been focused on.
Yeah.
And so it is important to understand them individually as risks, because it's that understanding that gives you the ability to see how they're integrated, see how one modifies another. So, for example, how climate risk modifies the safety risk, how the cyber risk modifies the safety risk, but modifies the operational risk. And so when we start to consider the layers of risk, we do really then start to see where our efforts need to be focused.
Interesting. And we're saying the key driver for this?
Well, if you look at the rate of change of adoption, right, the rate of change is significant. We've been implementing battery storage since 2018. And when you look at the growth since 2018 till today, you're looking at the deployment of around 100% growth between 2018 and now. And I think we're going to see that double again in the next 5 years.
Yeah, I was going to say, even in our insurance world within Zurich, we see more projects popping up, especially in the UK as well as globally. So you can have as many stats as you want, but we can see it day in, day out that the rate of adoption is increasing and the size of these projects is increasing as well.
Yeah, they are. The capacity mechanism also was interesting in 2025 with significant amounts of BESS being allocated, tariffs, if you like, to support the deployment.
So we're seeing lots and lots of these BESS projects, especially within the UK, being created, but you're saying maybe the capacity mechanism is something which is kind of stopping certain projects kind of reaching that full potential, or is there a kind of a squeeze point on that?
There's two factors. The connections, which has been delaying the deployment of BESS. Significant amount of BESS were in the backlog there. Let me just look at this information that we've got here. 300% of BESS connections were oversubscribed. So when you look at NESO's 2030 Clean Power Plan, they were 300% more than we needed in terms of capacity on there. And so what that connections reform process has managed to do is unlock that capacity, and I think it's unlocked something about 380 gigawatts of capacity.
Oh, wow.
Looking at the information, which relates to about an annual investment of about 40 billion.
Oh, wow.
And so you can see the power of connectivity.
Yeah.
You know, just the financial implication of not having an efficient process, which now NESO have made strides to streamline and move forward. So that's one point, isn't it?
Yeah.
But also the capacity mechanism. These projects, whilst they're important for our security of supply, they only get materialised if there's commercial support for them, right?
Okay.
And that's where your capacity mechanism comes in.
Sure.
And we see through T1 last year and T4 auctions that those awards for capacity payments are being provided, which is now enabling those. So a combination of the connections and the capacity mechanism is really promoting the use of this technology.
Okay. That's really, really interesting. So we're talking about how this capacity mechanism and this connectivity piece can be quite a bottleneck for certain projects. And then how do NESO kind of choose which projects to go ahead? Is that through the financial maturity of a project, the insurability of a project, or?
Yeah, so interestingly, NESO don't necessarily decide. NESO, if you like, facilitate through the connection process. Okay. So there are key steps in that BESS development, which of course are necessary for the project to move forward. So you need the connection. The connection then opens the door to the finance and the insurability, opens the door to the finance. And once those building blocks are in place, then obviously the project's got full steam ahead. From a cost point of view, what we understand is that actually the costs are projected to be 50% lower by 2030. Oh, wow. Right? So we see there another driver to the BESS adoption. We've got increase in connections, we've got decrease in costs, we've got an increase in how we want to use the technology, because we've moved away from the 1 hour original position of support for megawatts, and now we're seeing BESS deliver inertia support. We're seeing BESS deliver ancillary services, frequency response, secondary and primary. And so the requirement for BESS is changing. The cost of BESS is significantly lower, and so you see a world where everybody's waiting for it. And in some cases, we know that it's over subscribed or over installed Italy and Spain.
Mature markets.
And markets are mature, that's right. Which is where that acquisition piece comes in, right? Because we're starting to see now that actually there's no movement in new projects. And so it's about shifting around and releasing capital for some and investing in mature projects for others.
So there's a wide range of risks which are being driven by this BESS adoption, and the rate of the BESS adoption, the scale of the BESS adoption, and those sort of key drivers are, we're saying it's price, it's connectivity, it's maturity, it's lessons learned. What are the big things you think are kind of driving that risk profile? We say it's BESS adoption, but what elements of the BESS adoption do you find as those kind of key drivers?
So the BESS adoption itself doesn't drive risk. The pace of the adoption is influencing the risk profile, I would say.
Okay.
And so that risk profile, we focused on safety, haven't we? We focused on the stability of the battery cells, the thermal runaway piece. We focused on how we can contain and control a fire and thermal runaway. We're developing containers now that are able to hold a fire for more than 20 hours. We know of a couple of OEMs that are testing their containers to be able to do that. And so actually when you see that focus, we start to realize the maturity of managing and controlling that risk. What we don't hear a lot of is the other conversations around the wider project. So when we think about climate change, right, you know yourself the damage that climate and a big climate event can have on a project. And we know the importance of being able to adapt to climate change in that. And so what we don't hear a lot of is how the climate change or a climate event can impact on a project in its entirety.
Yeah.
So the safety piece was largely about container.
Yeah.
If you have one container, you got the safety issue. If you have 10, you have the safety issue. Of course, it morphs a little bit because of the distance between containers. But you got a climate event and it can take out your entire project, depending on where you are, depending on the exposure, and depending on the event of the day, right?
Yeah.
And of course, so there's climate change, which not a lot of people talk about, but we have to consider it.
Yeah. So we talk about climate change, and you said where we are in the project. So are we saying climate change can impact not just, let's say, a typical insured event like a flood or a storm or something like that, which actually physically damages BESS on site during operation? Are we saying climate change is also something which can occur maybe pre or post operate, pre-commissioning, during construction, or even before that?
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't matter which part of the life cycle you're in, climate change is a factor. And it doesn't have to be a one-off event, right? When we think about solar panels, we think about hail and we think about high winds and what that does. But actually, the gradual change of climate is an event over time, right? So if your HVAC systems are designed for 40 degrees ambient or 50 degrees ambient, and you start to see a change in that, so regularly through summer weeks, you're operating at a higher temperature, ambient temperature. What's the impact on your HVAC? What's the impact on the temperature inside the container? What's the impact on the ability for your cooling systems to be effective and efficient? But also, therefore, what's the operational knock-on, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're operating at high temperatures, does that limit how hard you can drive the battery systems, the recharge rates, your inverter performance? So these are the kind of things that we need to consider in the design of not necessarily just where you place the asset, but also how you design it and you future-proof it.
Yeah. So the technology piece in terms of so it being kind of used in the design phase, having those thoughts and on risk management, but also on climate change is really important.
What we see, right, even with gas turbine technology, in the design, there's a base set of conditions for the environmental location. What we're advocating is that a designer looks across the life cycle of this asset and says, right, okay, from my modelling, we can see that the likely ambient changes or the likely impact from hail events, flood events, heavy rain, pluvial, is X, and we need to consider that. So don't just design on today, but design across the life cycle of the asset.
That's really interesting. And we're talking about kind of looking ahead, and you mentioned previously about kind of the pace of technology and how technology is changing and how OEMs now are designing these BESS to kind of withstand fire events for longer. But we're also seeing an increase in energy density in these BESS modules.
Yeah.
We're seeing not drastic changes of design, but we're seeing the implementation of AI to kind of optimize BESS design. That kind of, for me anyway, talks about how the industry is and always has been ahead of the guardrails which kind of manage it, so the regulations and the standards. And I suppose with the rate of adoption like we're talking about, and the rate of change and the rate of technology upgrades, we're seeing that regulation still lag behind. Can you talk a bit about that as well?
Yeah, we can do. And I think it is related to where the focus was, right? So the focus was the fire risk. And so we saw a lot of technical support coming through the underwriting labs, 9540, for example, NFPA 855, and the IEC standards as well. I think it's 62933. But what's interesting is that the EU in 2023 pulled out a piece of statutory regulation. So rather than an industrial standard, which was there for guidance and support, now there's a piece of regulation. It's 2023-1542, and it brings together the obligations for any economic operator. It's a phrase that they use in the regulation that relates to those involved in the ecosystem and the touch points of a battery that lands in the EU. And it's basically requiring those economic operators to be accountable for the sustainability topics and also the safety topics of batteries. And so what you see is a requirement in that regulation for passports for batteries, and the use of QR codes to easily access the information of over the life cycle. It places an obligation to care for the environment, to understand the impact, for example, on mining of the raw materials, what that means for Indigenous groups, what that means for the socio environment in that location, and then it pulls all that together in a life cycle requirement. I've understated it for sure, but it's something that we are aware of, and from our underwriting perspective, we're considering those requirements for projects. And it also brings together all of the tests that we're familiar with now regarding fire safety, grid connectivity, into that regulation. And it's now an obligation for those economic operators to ensure that they have complied. So it's no longer, it's different, right? Yeah. It's no longer just a standard for guidance. It's a requirement, which is a significant change. It's been around since 2023, so it's 2026 now. Yeah. We should have people in the ecosystem who are familiar with that, but the depth of understanding may differ. And I think that's where ZRS can really add value in supporting clients understand their obligations.
Yeah, and like you said, it's a holistic standard, so it really encompasses everything.
Yeah,
not just the standard fire regulations or the fire standards that we're used to seeing for BESS, which is known as the biggest risk, thermal runaway being the biggest risk.
Yeah,
we're now seeing it implement all these other risks that we're going, and we'll probably go on to talk about in terms of supply chain, cyber, product life cycle, all of those.
Yeah, it all does come together in that way, doesn't it? I haven't seen a lot of traffic on the internet about the regulation. There's not been a lot of noise that I'm familiar with. So it is important that those economic operators are aware of it. Matt, we talked briefly about climate change and the fire risk, supply chain risk. We know also is integral into that integrated risk landscape.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like we said previously, climate change is something which doesn't just impact the operational side of things. It happens pre-commissioning. I think we need to think about the construction phases, supply chains. BESS nowadays typically come all from Asia or China specifically, but what we can see is there's a lot of heavy reliance on that, and that's a risk that we need to kind of be aware of. I think in 2023, the battery manufacturing, as we all know, was exceeded global demand, and that is something that manufacturers aren't looking at kind of repeating again. We're talking about the financial strain that can cause for manufacturers, and also about geopolitical dependencies. We're talking about a time now where there are a lot of risks associated to singular supply chains, and that's something that we see within BESS. So we need to kind of really think about how we can diversify that, whilst kind of keeping the costs low and keeping those economic drivers for BESS as well.
It's an interesting one, right? Because actually, yes, there's a supply to an individual, a supply risk to an individual project. But when you look at how globally there is reliance on BESS filling the strategic deployment of renewable energy. When you look at the supply chain risk, there's also a risk to the targets that we've set for clean power. Right. So if you can't get the raw materials quickly enough because of the demand, if you can't produce the cells because the factory capacities are full, there will be, as a minimum risk, a lag in the ability to achieve our targets. I mean, worst case, you may not achieve your targets at all. And also, what you do see in terms of supply chain pressures is costs then go up. So you might see a reversing of the trend depending on supply chains. And so we really do need an industry solution to the supply chain risk. We know that different sectors or regions are considering their own control mechanisms. I think in the States, they were looking at overbuilding strategies so that they can build in capacities rather than need to reach out for a second time. But it really does need to be considered more strongly in the round with all the other risk factors that we've got here. Hema, cyber is at the forefront of everybody's mind. There's almost a constant reminder for us of what a cyber event looks like, feels like, and costs. It doesn't have to be related to BESS, but we need to relate it to BESS for this conversation. So what are your thoughts on the cyber risk specifically for BESS?
I think it's definitely one of the emerging risks. We see nowadays that there's little to no regulation for BESS specifically in terms of cyber. These sites tend to be automated, very low personnel on site, so there's a high reliance on computers, automation, and now we're even seeing AI in certain spaces as well. We know that batteries and battery management systems are automated and computerized, but the cybersecurity requirements may not be there. And this is something which is going to be more relevant, I think, as the adoption increases and as the reliance on things like AI also increase as well. We're talking about how a cybersecurity event, and we can see how catastrophic they can be. And all it needs is one to then kind of open everyone's eyes up and say, oh, we didn't really think about that before. So it's almost trying to preempt what could happen and have those security measures in place to really keep the operational technology and that safety around those aspects kind of thought after and prepared against.
It's interesting, right? Because actually BESS is one of those technologies that would sit remotely in a field with very little human activity, a bit of security perhaps, regular maintenance popping in, but it's not like the conventional assets where you've always got site presence. And so the design is for them to be remotely observed, remotely operated. And so that then gives a greater opportunity for actors to come in and, if you like, take control of your battery storage facility.
And we're seeing it being a more critical infrastructure than
absolutely,
and it's just becoming more and more critical as we go on. So the security level is higher and higher. It's almost one of those things.
Right. So here's the layering, right? You get a handful of OEMs providing the infrastructure for the containers. So therefore the technology is similar across all of the global BESS storage. So as soon as an actor realizes how they can get access into one, the likelihood is they can get access into many. And so it doesn't take too much, therefore, to think beyond that and then suggest that actually there could be a mass BESS event. If BESS is the center for renewable energy storage and it's at the center of our clean power strategies, a BESS cyber attack across multiple projects, across multiple sectors,
jurisdictions,
it could have a significant event. And actually, it would be a reputational nightmare for the industry and for those involved. But interestingly, you think about cyber, because we're talking about here about a project, but a cyber attack that happens actually in a manufacturing facility.
Yeah.
We've talked about supply chain.
Yeah.
You get a cyber attack on a manufacturing facility or one organization's multiple facilities, you know, it then will stop production.
Yeah.
So the negative effect there down the line to deployment to achieving clean power is huge, right? So we've gone from having a straightforward cyber attack on one site to the entire supply chain being impacted. And again, another example of how that impacts on strategic achievement of our clean power goals.
It's all very doom and gloom, Sean.
It is all very but you know what? To pick it up right at the end, according to our cyber experts in ZRS, we cannot find a example of where a battery storage system has been successfully attacked.
Yeah.
And so the necessary sort of like demilitarized zones that would exist on those projects are working, you know, in terms of the operational technology versus information technology hardware. So we are in a good place, but it doesn't mean to say you can drop your guard. So the point of this conversation is the complexity of the landscape and the requirement to always look at these different risk factors.
Interesting. So, Sean, we were talking about the rate of deployment. We said that some markets were more mature than others, and what that might mean we see more mergers and acquisitions, changing of ownership of these projects. What sort of effects, what sort of risk is kind of associated to that?
Yeah, so I guess these are a little bit more subtle, right? And what we learned from the Energy Year conference last year is that there is movement now in buying and selling projects midway through the life cycle. No different from other assets. We've seen that in conventional power as well. So, for example, land being sold off, and the projects and the land go separate ways so that capital can be released in that way. And what we do see in conventional power assets is that as the asset ages, the investment criteria changes, whether it's OPEX or CAPEX. The maintenance plans and strategies alter because of the age. Now, arguably, the older things are, the more you need to spend, or the more optimum your maintenance strategies need to be. But of course, when assets are looking to be sold, it's quite often the case that big CAPEX expenditure isn't put in.
You must have seen that a lot.
You've seen it on different power assets where the major outages are delayed because it's going through a sale, and so there's a careful risk management piece there. Now, of course, we know it happens, and we know it happens successfully. But the important thing here is that during that mergers and acquisition process, any decisions to alter the maintenance programs, the investment programs, which were predetermined for the life cycle of the assets, we need to make sure that they're underpinned by good risk management. We need to make sure that we understand where the pinch points are, where the failure mechanisms are. You know, some components may be run to fail in terms of a strategy. Some may not be. But where we have an asset that is looking to be sold, those routine monthlies may get a quarterlies. You know, those inverters that can run for so many thousand hours might be over by 20%, 30%. What's the risk there? And the cooling systems, it's a cooling system that, you know, helps us prevent thermal runaway, right? If simply the pumps on that balance of plant, let's call it, are not maintained, you could end up with a failure. And you could end up with a high temperature situation on yourselves. So it's a subtle point, but as we start to see buying and selling, it's an important one to say, are you managing the risk right of these decisions?
And this is something that like we said, it's a new industry, but it's growing fast, and this is the sort of thing we're going to be seeing. Right. It's almost like looking into the crystal ball.
Yeah, it is. It is. So in this small half an hour conversation here, Matt, we've managed to demonstrate how the fire safety risk that has been the focus needs to be widened and needs to be covering more risk factors in order for those economic operators to satisfy themselves and others that the assets are safe and that our strategic imperatives for clean power can be met.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to sum up our first podcast, talking about BESS and the changing landscape from this rapid adoption. Thank you everyone for listening. We'll see you on the next one.
Thank you, Hema.
Thank you, Sean. Cheers.